shut the doors.
And just a quick note, so of course we have the portable microphones for the amplification here, but there's a number of people watching the stream. The only thing picking up the stream is this mic. So I'm gonna try, like I'll shift it once we get more Q&A, but like when you're doing your individual things, you could go there, or alternatively, I'll just shift the mic after Alondra goes, and then we can just put it in the center. But it's just like, just kind of just keep it. It wouldn't mind. It wouldn't be terrible to set up next to the mic. It's like, it's logistically tough with me.
Okay, we're about to start. All right, this is the last panel. I don't have a whole spiel other than to remind everybody that the after party, which is thrown by Verso. Thank you to Verso for doing that for us. There will be pizza, free pizza, drinks by donation. Sean Gray, friend of the conference, is DJing. Also with Meredith Graves. She's like a special guest surprise DJ for tonight. So come on out. It's like 2 subway stops. Hop on 2nd Avenue. Go under the river, hop out, and you're at the party. So with that, again, one last thank you, and I'm going to hand this over to Alondra for our final panel. This was the first panel we organized for the conference. And I think it was born, I was hanging out with Gabriella in her office in Montreal. We said, it'll be a really cool panel. And it was the first one we organized for the whole conference. And I'm really, really excited personally for this panel. One last thank you to everybody for coming out and donating. And I'll see you at the party. I'll hand it to Alondra.
I think Jason's going to. Oh, right.
Sorry.
That's cool.
That's cool.
Sorry, Alondra's going first. Up to our moderator.
You got it. Hi, everyone. Well, we've seen some absolutely amazing presentations today over the last couple of days.
Pull the mic closer.
Hello. We've seen some great presentations over the last couple of days. I'm sure that's going to continue with this panel. I'm Ayesha Siddiqi. I write a column and features for The Guardian. In a former life, I was actually a digital culture researcher. One of the last things I did was to interview a bunch of content moderators and people who run social media accounts for politicians who were very happy to tell me about the way in which their health problems stem from just dealing with a torrent of horrible content every day. So I'll be really interested to see what our panelists have to say about the topic. I'll introduce them as we go. So Alondra Nelson is the Dean of Social Science and Professor of Sociology and Gender Studies at Columbia University, where she served as the Director of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender and Sexuality. She writes about the intersections of science, technology, medicine and inequality. Her next book, The Social Life of DNA, Race and Reconciliation After the Genome, is forthcoming from Beacon Press in 2015. So take it away, Alondra.
Hi, thanks, Jason. It's great to be here with these smart interlocutors and to be at this conference, which has now become an institution and a tradition, which is hard to do in New York City. So, as Jason sort of suggested, I've been writing about direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing. I've written about the circulation of YouTube videos and social media around genetic ancestry testing. I've written recently about 23andMe and the sort of category confusion and regulatory confusion about its classification as either a medical or genealogical tool. And as I was thinking about pathologies and technologies for today, I kept dwelling on the work that I spent a lot of time doing, which is the Black Panther Party. So I want to sort of go back in time to sort of make some observations about social media and how we might think about health and technology and activism as well around these issues, which I think that we'll all share in our conversation. And particularly the part of what I'll talk about with regard to the Black Panther Party is their pretty path-breaking grassroots genetic screening and counseling. It's the first known, I think only known, grassroots genetic screening program known to the world, which I'll say a bit more about. But I think in a moment where a lot of the sort of politics around health or around rare or neglected genetic diseases sort of communities forming around genetic marker deletions and these sorts of things that the Panthers offer a kind of prescient way of thinking about social media and community around genetic disease. So, and I guess the other thing I want to say that I'll leave sort of hanging in the air that I think you'll see when we go back allows us to force the question of whether or not some of the things that we've been talking about this weekend, and certainly that we'll talk about in this panel, are actually about social media. Are they about other kinds of forms of sociality and activism that precede social media? So I think that you'll see here there are things that look like they could have been akin to work that's happening in social media era or social media age around health and the politics of health and technology, but certainly this was 4 or 5 decades before. So I was initially told I had 10 minutes, and then on my way here I got an email that said I had 7 minutes. So because I only had 10 minutes, I wasn't so it's venturesome as to venture a 10-point theory of health and technology for the social media age. I went for 6 points, and now that I have 7 minutes, I probably should have gone for 4, but I'll be speedy. Okay, so a 6-point Black Panther Party theory of health and technology for the social media age. Information does not want to be free, but demand that it is because your life may depend upon it being so. So as an example of this, I offer you from the Black Panthers' famous 10-point platform, their point 6. We want completely free health care for all Black and oppressed people. They revised it in 1972 from their original 1966, October 66. But what I want to point out here, for virtue of our conversation about health and politics, is the last sentence, which they say, we believe that mass health education and research must be developed to give all Black and oppressed people access to advanced scientific and medical information, so we may provide ourselves with proper medical attention and care. So what you have here is a sort of declaration or a demand for universal health care, but also for access to advanced medical and technical information, right? And the sense that there is a sort of DIY and an agency, a kind of level of participation that people can have with their health care when they have access to this information. Something that's not dissimilar from our desire to sort of reduce and eliminate paywalls around health information that our tax dollars pay for example. Secondly, second point in their theory that I would offer is that, among other things, DIY can be or is self-care. So in the Black Panthers' work, it became a sort of national network of health clinics that I write about, but it also became things like this. It became a free ambulance service program, in which they participated getting technical training as EMTs, but also that they had to do for their communities because it wasn't provided for their communities. And so it was a kind of level of technical skill that was required to do the DIY that I offer for us, but also it's a kind of a DIY work that really is about literally caring for the lives of the people in the communities. Third, technology to and for the people. As I mentioned, the Panthers were engaged in large-scale genetic screening and testing and counseling. This was enabled in part by the technology transfer that happened in 1968, a change in technology. So up until that point, in order to analyze genetic testing, you had to, do analysis for genetic disease required the use of kind of large gel electrophoresis machines, which are still used today, although they're much smaller. The Panthers take advantage. They're the early adopters of a new technology called SickleDex, which is still used today in limited degree, but emerges in 1968. And it was effectively a form of biohacking. So the Panthers you could use you took a blood sample from someone, you mixed it in a test tube with a reagent, and the translucence or the opacity of what resulted, which is pictured here, told you whether or not that person had sickle cell anemia trait or disease, right? So, it's akin to what's happening in sort of hobbyist labs today, using sort of the portability and the small scale of sort of PCR machines and the like to kind of do forms of biohacking. And this is what it looked like sort of on the ground. This is in Oakland Park. Point 4 is bringing attention to neglected or rare diseases, conditions. Politicizing any kind of health issue requires an activated network. And in the Panthers' case, I think that it's true of all sort of social media campaigns around health politics in particular. They had two types of networks that were important, right? So they had a network that had a lot of, to use a social network term, a lot of homophily, so there was a lot of sort of similarity in the people that were in the network, and there was density within that network of folks. And then you had sort of big nodes in the network that could sort of bring celebrity to bear on the project of sickle cell anemia, right? So you were able to gather large people at parks here, tell them about this genetic disease, and create this campaign about it. They were also able to use their relationship with, pictured here, John Lennon and Yoko Ono in the center with Bobby Seale and 2 members of the Black Panther Party on the Mike Douglas show during the week that he turned over the reins to Yoko Ono and John Lennon, and he had other guests like Abby Hoffman to talk about sickle cell anemia on this national television show. So much like the mobilization around Trayvon Martin, which required lots of people, individuals, a density of networks of homophily with hoods, but also celebrities who were willing to do that. Much like genetic ancestry testing really relies on a consumer base, a dense consumer base of people using it, but also celebrities who sort of give voice to the importance of the work for their health or for their ancestry. It was a similar kind of network, dual network strategy. Fifth, I offer that technology, of course, is a double-edged sword. It can be that access to it and strategic use of it must be coupled with vigilance about its excesses. And so while the Panthers were working to bring attention to this neglected genetic disease through the networks that they established, they were also working to combat forms of theories of genetic essentialism that disproportionately affected poor Black and brown communities. So in this case, there was a controversy that the Panthers were involved in the 1970s around psychosurgery and around suggestions and bespoke violence in the brain, among others, that African Americans and Latinos and also women at different stages in their menstrual cycle were more prone to violence because of their forms of sort of hormonal and genetic predisposition. And so here the Black Panther Party are using their sort of biohacking, one might say, to make claims against genetic scientists about genetic essentialism, right? So here, pictured here, the Black Panther Party challenges inferiority theory. This is from their newspaper, and it's effectively coverage of a press conference in which Elaine Brown and Bobby Seale sort of castigate and challenge an international society of geneticists that's meeting at UC Berkeley, and they basically accuse them of making sort of racist assumptions and hypotheses about genetics and offer their own genetics, analyses of genetics as a counterpoint. Which is to say that, that the Panthers had a very kind of multifaceted understanding of the technology, about the health politics they were doing around genetics and race more particularly. Lastly, I would offer that disruptive innovation can not only dismantle the state, but move the state. And as an example of this, I offer, as my last slide, an outcome of the Black Panther Party's work, which was increased state funding for research into sickle cell anemia that goes from $100,000 in 1972 to $1.2 million from the federal government in the following year, based in large part on the Panthers' work. So I'll end it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Okay, so our next speaker is Merritt, Merritt's the author of over 2 dozen digital accounts about bodies, intimacy, and desire. In 2014, she was named one of Polygon's 50 admirable people of gaming. Her first book, Video Games for Humans, is an anthology of interactive fiction, created using the free development tool Twine. Take it away, Merritt.
Okay, so disclaimer, I'm on about 2 hours of sleep, and I don't know how many cups of coffee I've had today, so we'll see where this takes us. So I want to talk about 3 things. I want to talk about video games, trans people, and mental health. So first of all, here is I'm going to be a games evangelist for a second. That's not normally the role I occupy, but games are increasingly a space where people are articulating complex ideas around subjectivity, around mental illness, around interiority, and a lot of this work is being done by marginalized people. So especially people with mental illnesses and trans people, and there's a large overlap of those people making games. So you might ask, why is that? Because video games are all about matching candy or shooting bros, right? Traditionally, yes. So there have been sort of this wave of tools that have made individual game development a lot more accessible than it has been over the last like decade or so, which actually harkens back to a way earlier tradition of hobbyist development, but that's not really what we're here to talk about. So there's this ease of production, there's an ease of distribution. It's way easy to distribute a lot of these games. They're in like formats like HTML, they're very easy to spread around. And also I think there's something about non-linear formats for telling stories that people are starting to explore, and especially when we're thinking about complex stories around mental health, around marginalization. I think there's an attraction that a lot of people feel to these kinds of formats that naturally resist a linear narrative. So tools like Twine and GameMaker and Unity have built up these communities around them, and to some extent they've decentralized game production. Obviously the games industry is still very much alive and well, and it's still their GTA and Halo and those kinds of things. But there are these little growths, these little shoots happening up in the cracks. So a big example that, has anyone heard of Depression Quest? Okay, so that's like the big example that a lot of people have heard about. So Depression Quest, for people who don't know, is a text-based game about someone's experience with depression. It basically tries to model that experience by limiting the options that you as the character have. It sort of gives you options that you can see but not take depending on your mental state. And it's been really highly publicized, but it's not the only one. That's sort of the tip of the iceberg. There's like dozens or hundreds of games like that that have been produced over the past couple of years. And a lot of this work is being done by women, and a lot of them are trans women. So people like Amy Dentata, Lydia Neon, AVB, Porpentine, all these people are doing really compelling work in interactive fiction and games. And if you aren't aware of sort of the history of trans narratives, this is like a really, really big deal. So the kind of historical narrative format that trans people have been allowed to occupy is the memoir. And the memoir is like a fundamentally outwardly facing genre, right? It's like, it's for people who aren't trans to consume a narrative of how weird and cool and interesting and sexy and disgusting it is to transition. It's aimed at edifying or titillating the reader, and basically it just takes this one slice of someone's life and sort of doesn't care what happens to them afterwards. But by using interactive fiction in games, trans authors have carved out this kind of really powerful space, creating work that's meant for other trans people, which is super cool, in the same way that a lot of novelists have been doing the past couple of years, so people like Imogen Binney, Casey Plett, and Sybil Lamb. But this work is being carried out against a backdrop of like a gaming community that is still incredibly hostile to women. So I think some folks were talking about Gamergate before, so everyone at this point probably knows what that is, right? So Gamergate is basically this reactionary, racist, sexist, pro-capitalist movement whose primary tactics are coordinated online harassment of women and people of color, as well as offline actions like swatting. And these actions have sort of gained some visibility outside games communities, but most of the narratives around that resistance and around those actions are really simple, and most of the targets who become spokespeople are white cisgender women. And there's sort of been some vague acknowledgement of like, oh, well, intersectionality, and like, oh, of course, like, trans women get it worse, and like, women of color get it worse, but like, it's always in this very quantitative mode where we're not actually exploring the subjective differences of receiving harassment online. It's just assumed to be worse. It sort of builds on the sort of like base level of what a like hypothetical white cis woman gets. So I want to talk a bit about the experiences of trans people really quick. So the way that we've seen the internet and trans people historically, I think, has been like, well, the internet is this amazing space of possibility where anything can go, and you can be any gender you want, or like you can be a fox, or you can be a dragon. Pretty cool. So here's the thing though, like that goes back to the whole memoir thing, right? It's really interested in the transition part. It's like, wow, you can experiment and there's so much freedom. But what happens to trans people on the internet after that's not what they're doing anymore? They're like, okay, cool, I'm good. I'm not a dragon, not that there's anything wrong with that. But I'm good, and like, okay, let's move on. Cis scholarship doesn't historically really care what happens after that. So I think we need to think about like what it actually looks like to be trans online. And I think really quickly, here's sort of like a sketch of some of my experiences and other people's experiences. Being trans online means hearing about suicides almost constantly, and then being told not to talk about them by people who aren't trans because you might spread suicide contagion. It also means constantly hearing about murders, especially of sex workers and women of color, and then being reminded that really few people seem to care about that. And when it comes to sexist harassment campaigns, trans women experience the same kinds of mental health issues, but there's also other consequences. So for trans women, harassment, like in games, for example, has an additional dimension. It's not just like, you don't belong here, it's like, you are fundamentally wrong about who you say you are. So campaigns targeting trans women typically seek to dig up dead names and old photos and spread them through chan boards and burner accounts with the goal of dehumanizing their victims. And this kind of harassment that people are talking about as like coming up in like to new levels with Gamergate is not new. So for years, feminists, well, self-described feminists, under the kind of rubric of trans-exclusive radical feminism, have been using the exact same tactics that Gamergate has been sort of publicizing lately. So things like calling employers, things like trying to harass people off the internet. So this sort of feminist politics of suspicion that sees trans women as fundamentally male infiltrators in feminist movements. And so for trans people using the internet, the permanence of computer-mediated communication can be really scary because you are leaving this history that potentially can be traced back to you and weaponized against you. And for trans people, those attacks don't come exclusively from like the outside. We can't appeal to this sort of solidarity of like, we're all in this together, we're huddling against Gamergate, those horrible dudes. Because there's this sense of like, well, that could come from anyone. So the result, I think, for a lot of people is a state of justified paranoia, this need to be like vigilant, that like anyone around you could at any moment turn on you or have some terrible ideas that they just haven't voiced yet. And that any of your behavior could be documented and turned against you at any time. So what do? Maybe you stop talking about the issues that you're talking about, maybe you pull away from social media, maybe you just say fuck it, maybe you keep going, but you still have to grapple with these consequences. Do I have like 2 minutes left?
Yeah.
Okay. We're gonna go through those. Okay. So things get even more complicated when we bring in the material realities of survival in capitalist economies, right? So many of the people that I was talking about before who are doing this great work that people love to praise are supported through non-traditional means, right? So things like Patreon have been really big for these kinds of communities because they have they provide kind of a direct means for these folks to sort of survive outside of a traditional labor economy. And for folks who don't know, Patreon is basically just like a subscription crowdfunding service. And so games and social media have kind of created a space for some trans women to survive through gaining celebrity as like a form of capital, right? So capital keeps people alive insofar as it can be turned into money. But celebrity capital is also, it makes people higher value target for harassment, right? And insofar as celebrity becomes a matter of material security, it also restricts the range of speech you're capable of. And to be clear, I'm not talking about people with like PR staff and like professional reputations and carefully manicured Twitter presences. I'm talking about people who are getting by at a few $100s a month and for whom losing $50 a month is like a significant loss. And in that case, any critical speech that's more nuanced or complex than an easily parsed denouncement of like those bad people out there is really hard to articulate, especially because trans women in particular are always already figured as excessive, pathological, over-emotional, angry, violent, abusive, and so on. So for example, if I want to talk about how it sometimes sucks to be a trans woman in queer communities, in spaces that are not only supposed to be welcoming and friendly to me, I have to be super careful about it. I have to deliver my critiques in a way that doesn't make anyone feel like I'm talking about them, but I'm talking about those bad people outside. And people who refuse to play that game and sort of talk about their experiences candidly are told by total strangers that they're too angry, that their experiences are false, that they're crazy, or that they're abusive. And under those circumstances, you might not be like out of the question to think maybe you are crazy or maybe you are a bad person. And so you would learn really quickly to manage your effective presence online, to try and strike a balance between the gaslighting and hostility of speaking truth and the quiet depression of being one of the good ones. And so being a public trans person or micro-celebrity becomes this kind of affective trap. And I think to some extent this is probably an experience that's shared by all people who have experienced like complex marginalities and who have to cultivate an audience-facing persona in order to survive. And I think that's something that is worth talking about like outside and with regards to broader communities. So maybe we can do that. I'll leave it there.
The next speaker is Ayesha Siddiqi. She's a cultural critic and the editor-in-chief of the New Inquiry. She writes on intersections of race, gender, class, and pop culture, using American icons to discuss the production and maintenance of social values. Thanks.
Sure. Well, everyone, thanks so much for being here tonight, and I'm so pleased to follow Alondra and Merritt because I think so much of what you've already said speaks to the questions I'm interested in. Right? Sure. Yeah, I can hear the difference already. Some of the questions I'm interested in bringing to you all tonight, and hopefully in being able to answer in the future, if not by the end of our panel discussion. A lot of what's been happening recently, I mean, the internet as it was developed was always a confessional space in a lot of ways. I mean, some of the earliest websites were places that people talked about themselves and their experiences, and that certainly hasn't changed today, even if we've gone from, LiveJournal to MySpace to Tumblr and Twitter. And what's interesting about that for people who rarely see themselves reflected within a culture, have their stories told, is that in telling their own stories are connecting and reaching and finding people who share those stories who could maybe have similar experiences and can speak to that. And so the development of community online has also enabled a form of life hacking. And it's so interesting to me that the phrase life hack has a reputation of being associated with this very superficial sort of white tech bro-y, here's fun things you can do around your apartment. And it gains a great deal more gravity when, I see it as a perfectly apt phrase to describe the innovation with which marginalized communities have been able to generate and share and circulate survival scripts on spaces like Tumblr and Twitter. And so some of you guys may have been hearing the phrase self-care more so as it's left these communities online, these niche conversations, and seeing posts in places like women's magazines or online publications with a far more mainstream audience, suddenly using self-care, talking about self-care. And it's interesting, those posts typically summarize it as something like, have a glass of wine after work and put on a face mask, you deserve it, right? And that's really, it's funny to see it captured that way when the urgency that it holds in spaces like Tumblr, where it's young people of color talking about the things they need to do to not only access a form of, or escape the form of self-loathing that they've lived with, and identify as being worthy of, actions that would seem to be, the basic moves we do to survive and move through the world and make it to the next day, and to sort of remove the sense of these are indulgences, right? And as the concept of self-care is growing more popular, it's worth looking at it a bit more critically and seeing why, one of the things that self-care takes for granted is that, it extends the capitalist logic of our isolation. And it puts the burden of taking care of yourself entirely on the person, that this is something that not only you're entirely responsible for, but to which you can attach an ethic that can eventually lead to being just as burdensome as the things that were keeping you from effectively taking care of yourself in the first place. And so this idea that the popularity of the idea of self-care and it becoming a priority, I think, diminishes the value and urgency of generating communal care and the labor required to better take care of each other. So what I'm not seeing happen now is conversations and research into, well, what are the things that are keeping us from taking care of ourselves in the first place, and the ways in which, a lot of times, there's some overlap between things that are coping mechanisms and also triggers, right? And so as the effects of racism and sexism, there's an emergent vocabulary that recognizes those experiences as being traumatic and recognizes those experiences as being abusive. That's it's important because now it's finally, the mental health effects of living through racism and sexism are finally being dealt with. But as those conversations leave the niche communities of, you know, bloggers or people who've gotten to know each other through their discussion of these experiences, it's blocking the conversation of identifying and resolving the origins of those traumas. And naturally, the scale of that project is much, much bigger, so it becomes not so much how do you get through the day and keep going, but what do we do to dismantle the oppressive structures and the violence of capitalism and the legacies of colonialism and the ways in which these political and economic forces engender isolation and become the barriers to not only our ability to take care of each other, but ultimately our ability to take care of ourselves. So the innovation with which people of color, young people especially, have been able to share what are really, you know, amateur mental health resources is really interesting to me because, again, these are people for whom these resources are much harder to access for a range of reasons. So if you're a student, and again, students suffer, you know, some of the highest rates of depression, mental health illnesses, you know, the suicide rates for undergrads has been steadily increasing. How do we respond to that? You know, that's obviously not the reality we want to allow to continue. For a lot of these students, particularly students of color who experience depression and anxiety in the context of the education system, options, you know, even if they get to the point at which they feel comfortable seeking help, there are, you know, the ability of those resources to help these people is just, it's abysmal. I mean, you'll encounter counselors or students who, or, you know, the mental health resources of your school may end up, in effect, reproducing the violence and trauma that you're trying to cope with in the first place, particularly if they're, you know, the most common problem is the lack of cultural context for your experience. So if you're a first-generation college student, the culture that you're coming from is going to be one that your probably white counselor has no frame of reference for, and if not, you know, recommending to you something that would be actively harmful, might in turn recommend interventions into, you know, turn this, what, you know, the extent, like in so many ways these schools and institutions are an extension of the state apparatus, turn them back onto your family and treat a lot and respond to your personal history and cultural context as what needs to be remedied, not really the environment that you're currently finding yourself in and able to cope. So again, when you're finding yourself in systems that were designed to fail you because they weren't meant for you, it's no surprise then that so many young people of color have then turned to, you know, in continuing the tradition of being confessional on the internet, exchanging their stories, finding the fact that these are shared experiences and these aren't things that can and should continue to isolate them. And that moment of innovation, I think, is particularly exciting for me because, one, it speaks to the creativity and power of immigrants, of members of diasporic communities, but also it adds that element of, and this the necessary element of communal care and the idea of taking care of each other, which is fundamentally absent from recommendations that will come to you from within, you know, the capitalist hierarchy. And making interventions, you know, into the mental health resources available in ways in which that not only generate survival scripts that are able to circulate outside of, you know, your own personal domestic space, but respond to the structural oppression that colonialism and capitalism produce, that is incredibly exciting. So the questions that emerge from that moment are, you know, then is this creating a viable mental health resource in this sort of alternative DIY space? You know, if you look on Tumblr, self-harm is a tag that's blocked. That's not going to yield results for you. And there's a lot of ways in which these platforms have responded to the internet as a confessional space by blocking content that it's recognizing as triggers. And I don't think that we have yet been able to effectively distinguish the difference between coping mechanisms and triggers for people grappling with anxiety, depression, the impulse of self-harm, and the ways in which they're exchanging those experiences and, you know, their sort of DIY efforts at dealing with those impulses. So these technological, you know, corporate platforms as one actor within this mold, the idea of the people seeking an alternative to the oftentimes violent and unhelpful resources that they are faced with. And again, those are all people that even have access to these. There's still significant swaths of population for whom it's still not available. And so you look at how underfunded and underdeveloped mental health resources in America are across the board, it becomes particularly inaccessible for all the people for whom their experiences are still foreign to the resources that they may be recommended to turn to. And yeah, the idea of self-generating these scripts in a way that involves a response to structural oppression and that makes that link between the isolation and because that capitalism produces and encourages and requires to sustain itself. It's not only really exciting, but I think it's what's going to yield valuable, you know, theoretical and clinical alternatives that can eventually reach some of these institutions in an effort to reform them. And so, but that requires critically engaging with and recognizing what all of these people are doing online for themselves and for each other, because what's motivating that, we have to remember, is truly the desire to find something to help them get through the day. I mean, so that's why I find the word life hack like particularly poignant in applying to this, because it does become then a matter of life and death.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so our next speaker is Gabriella Coleman. She holds the Wolf Chair in Scientific and Technological Literacy at McGill University, and she's the author of two really good books on computer hackers that you should read. But anyway, yeah, take it away, Gabriella.
Thanks so much, and it is really great to be here. I've experienced theorizing the web on the web for many years, and so it's nice to be here in the flesh. In a little bit of an unusual position where I just finished a very big project, and what I'm going to talk about is kind of a future project that has been close to me for many years, in part because I have done quite a bit of research in the past about mental health issues, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those to then contextualize where I hope to go in the future. So basically, I was actually trained as a medical anthropologist, and one of my big interests was, I think, one of the most kind of politically vexing questions and hurdles of the 20th century. And it's this question: how did those and do those people who are deemed crazy, mad, how do they gain a credible voice when the very category of being mad makes you irrational, right? I mean, that is the core problem, I think, of a lot of folks who are labeled mad, or even who embrace actively the category of madness. And so I did work for a number of years on the psychiatric survivor movement, whose birth came in the 1960s, and they did gain a voice. And I think that's a really significant political moment. And the way that they gained a voice is obviously a very complicated story. It has to do with media, like newsletters, and how they found each other. They rode the wave of revolutionary movements at the time that included everything from the Black Panthers to the anti-war movements to a lot of health movements. But the one that kind of really interested me, and I wrote a little bit about, was the way that madness was embraced as something positive to herald society as pathological. It was society that was pathological, and it was the mad who could see society as pathological. And there was all sorts of writers, from Marcuse to Martin Luther King, who were making this connection. I'm just going to read one quote from Martin Luther King, who said, "I'm proud to be maladjusted. I say very honestly that I never intend to become adjusted to segregation and discrimination." And so I think that there was something about the value placed on madness as a way to diagnose society's pathological that helped open up a kind of conceptual space for the mad to be legitimate and credible actors in the world. Now the problem is, it was a voice that was gained, but it's difficult to retain that voice. Again, for categorical, ontological reasons, and different climates at different moments made it hard for these psychiatric survivors to retain their voice. In the 1980s, there was a new kind of consumer movement that designated drugs as a safe alternative in comparison to previous technologies like electric shock therapy. And you were mad, irrational, if you did not embrace this new kind of paradigm of drug taking. And psychiatric survivors and new generations of mad liberation activists were very, very crafty in how they regained their voice. And I'm not going to talk about how they did that, but that is the sort of research I did. And then it kind of stopped in its tracks a little bit when Anonymous exploded. I was working on them, and I decided to kind of follow them because I do have this huge passion for politics. And at a certain point, it became clear as I worked 6 years on Anonymous, I had done already 5 years of research on computer hackers, that within the world of hacking, the question of pathology, disability, mental illness was as central as it was among, let's just say, mad liberation activists. And so all of a sudden I was like, okay, I could return to one of these core passions of mine and look at the intersections between disability, madness, abnormality, and hackers. In over 15 years of studying hackers, there's two kind of very obvious trends. Now, unlike what Merritt was talking about, where in some ways trans folks are just categorically mischaracterized and in some ways their, quote, madness comes to the fore, I mean, hackers kind of occupy an unusual position where on the one hand they're often seen as superhuman, geniuses, larger than life humans, and really respected as a result. But on the other hand, they're also, I think, consistently seen as quite pathological inherently. They're off-kilter, obsessive, asocial, and I don't know how many times I've actually interacted with people who at one point in their lives, knew no hackers. At some point they met some and they go to me, wow, I'm just surprised, they're really kind of nice and normal. And I think this kind of thread of pathology kind of runs deep in terms of how we see them, but of course it's ambivalent insofar as they're also coded as superhuman and kind of genius characters. Now, hackers are not pathological, right? And in fact, talk about institutional settings. Hackers are often tagged as being obsessive. When I compare them to academics, I feel like we're equally obsessive, but we have these fancy universities that, authorize our work, right? So the institutional settings really change the way that we see those kind of characteristics. Now, while they're not pathological, it was clear that disability really marks the past and present of hacking in really dramatic ways, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. And I'm interested in both the particularities among hackers as well as the ways in which there's universal elements to these conditions. So the phone freaks who were proto-hackers who used to kind of explore phone systems, well, many of them were blind, and in fact, some of the first phone freaks were blind, and they spread the word of freaking in blind camps, and for them, freaking was truly a form of freedom and liberation. And this is very specific way of concretizing freedom, and I prefer these ways of exploring freedom than the kind of generalized ways that get tagged to technology. A lot of hackers, experiment with gender bending, change genders. Of course, this is not a disability, but suffer the forms of discrimination, marginalization that Merritt talked about. There's classic burnout as well. Working in the tech industry, it's a very demanding work environment. There's also a lot of repetitive strain injuries. One of the most famous hackers, Richard Stallman, who created the idea of free software, actually fell prey to repetitive stress injury when he was engaging in a political act of revenge programming. There's high rates of suicide as well, some very famous cases such as Aaron Schwartz, but it's a pretty common occurrence. And then there's, of course, copious forms of, depression, bipolar, insofar as folks themselves say, yes, I suffer from depression, I have autism. And it was really notable because during the course of my research on Anonymous, I think in part because of the pseudo-anonymous environment, there were many moments and times when people confessed either mental health conditions, that they use the terminology mental health, or they express deep existential pain. And I really actually wanted to write about this connection, but I didn't really have the space in my book, nor did I really have the time to consider, really unpack some of the connections. But I did write this. I said, I'm unable to decide whether Anonymous attracts those with dark emotional lives or whether the pseudo-anonymous environment creates a safe space for sharing what are simply universal facets of the human condition. Likely some combination of the two. I was nevertheless struck time and again by this pairing of personal pain with the ardent desire for its overcoming. And one of the things that I really kind of realized, and this now goes back to the opening of these thoughts, is that the pathologies of society do make us crazy, right? And that activism itself is a form of madness in a very positive sense because of the pathologies of society. And I was able to see this in a really profound way during the course of my anonymous research, again because of the anonymity, I think, allowed me to see it in a new way that I didn't see it in other domains of activism. Now just to kind of wrap up a little bit, one of the ironies is that if hackers are kind of treated as sub-pathological, weirdly enough, I think it contributes in favorable ways to something more laudable, which is, you can thrive in hacker circles and many tech sectors if you do have a disability. In part, there's kind of an expectation that you're going to be quirky or weird. People don't care about your condition so long as you produce. There's kind of favorable and disfavorable elements. But the reason why I raise this is I am interested in the sorts of spaces where people with disabilities can survive and thrive. And I think there's very few of those enclaves. I think academia might be one of them. I think hacking is another one. And so part of this project is exploring that kind of connection. But really now, just to really wrap up, as I mentioned, I'm at the beginning of this project. In a lot of ways, I have a lot of just firsthand experience because of the research I've done over 15 years, but it's not something I've really I have not dived deeply in. But I am concerned that while my aim might be to depathologize hacking and open up some new questions, I just might recapitulate the pathology of hacking because the association is so strong. So really, if I embark on this project, questions of writing and representation are going to be acutely kind of important. So I think I'll just leave it at that and turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to all four of you. They were all really fantastic presentations, really provocative, I think, and really, unexpectedly optimistic, I think, because I think one of the things that tied all those presentations together is the way in which people were talking about how different groups kind of force the issue, if you like, of access to a technology or a platform or a repository of information or a voice, in order to carry out these projects of mutual aid. When I think about the precarious kind of media workers I was talking to, who are either not managing to do that or right at the beginning of it. I guess my question for all of you would be, you know, how can people learn from these instances you've talked about? I mean, how do you begin that process of creating kind of spaces together? I mean, what kinds of things kick it off? What kinds of things enable people to start doing that?
So a lot of what I talked about spoke to that exact pursuit. I mean, it's people in process of developing viable mental health recourses. And I mean, the only option really is to be optimistic about it, because that's, you know, after required to undergo that endeavor at all. Otherwise, why bother trying? So it is motivated by the idea that, well, our needs aren't going to be met unless we meet them ourselves. And are we allowed to ask each other questions?
Yeah.
Okay. I did have some questions for Gabriella. I think a lot of what you talked about was super, super interesting, and it reminded me of some of the experiences of the people I've seen online in that process, right? So you mentioned how the position of being labeled irrational or mad, and the way in which the reception to that position has shifted over history. I think that's especially relevant to people of color, because as we experience racism, we're consistently and often told that, well, you're just being too sensitive, or that's all in your head. You know, ways in which it's our experiences and responses are pathologized as something internal to us that we have to then remedy ourselves, and not a response triggered by the attitudes and environments that we're encountering outside of our heads. And so I think that the question of how we produce and maintain the category of mad is especially relevant on that level, and then also on the level of, how, well, I guess this is connected to the second point that I wanted to pose to you, which was, we talked about the ways hackers are pathologized as being these superhuman people. I think a lot of that is produced by the way we as a society under white supremacy are trained to respond to particular traits in white bodies. So traits that would mark others as crazy loners who deserve being watched are sentimentalized in a way in which that, oh, he's so, being on the autism spectrum makes him especially valuable or interesting or worth caring about, or enables him to be further qualified to work in fields of tech and science. And I mean, I think that's entirely connected to the ways in which we respond to racialized bodies, and it's something that comes from that and is now being applied to this category of the hacker, which is still a figure that's seen as, a straight white male. And again, I mean, these are patterns that because they've existed historically, we can see them exist across not just the conversation on online cultures and communities, but again, the way then we respond to the mad loner who, short shot up a school or a movie theater or public space, but, well, he was insane. His madness is something that it just means something so different to a white person, for whom that adds a texture of our understanding of them and their experience, versus something we use then to silence, further marginalize, and then erase, or rather ignore, the voices of women, people of color, etc. And yeah, I was just wondering what your thoughts on that are, and how these categories that you've so astutely pointed out replicate patterns that have a long-standing history.
I mean, I think in some ways you've answered your own question at some level, insofar as, well, first of all, it's clear that the ways that we conceptualize everything from racialized bodies to the category of madness really have material force in the world, right? They're conceptual, but they really pattern everything from expectations to possibilities. And categories like madness are in operation with other ones at the same time, which kind of compound and can make things even worse. And I think, you know, going to Jason's question as to like what can be done. I mean, I think one of the lessons, especially from the psychiatric survivor mad liberation movement, is that any gain that's made is almost always temporary, if that makes sense. It's always an ongoing project because of the kind of weights of you know, colonial histories or these categories themselves. And so the important thing is to forge, and this is why I really liked your opening very much, you know, self-care in some ways is fine, but it's totally inadequate, right? I mean, completely inadequate. And so, for example, in order to forge a politics where you can fight the irrationality, the category madness, you need strong kind of communities and mutual aid. And I do think the internet does actually really can help in that project. It's a part of it. But once that kind of community fractures or goes away, you're going to kind of lose the battle.
So just in response to Ayesha and I wanted to just remind or sort of add to the conversation John Lee, who is the first African American to ever appear on the cover of Wired magazine in 1994, who's a hacker, who is not only superhuman and pathologized, but criminalized, right? So, you know, and this is to your point about sort of how, you know, race and gender sort of affect even how we think about genius and pathology. I also wanted to say just a few words about to bring the Panthers into this actually in the conversation, because a part of the work that they were doing drew on a lot of radical philosophers about health and society, right? So they were writing about, in conversation with Frantz Fanon, who wrote very much about the impossibility of any kind of sanity in a colonial or racist or sort of society. And so they very much understood, I use the concept social health in my book, with this idea that you couldn't be, your body literally cannot be healthy in a society that's rife with its own kind of forms of pathology, right? That's a kind of different kind of pathology. And then thinking about the hacker example, I was also thinking about the pathologization is also about the threat to the state and to the market, right? So that gets then sort of translated, right, as a kind of sickness or illness, right? Because who could be against the market, you know, right? Who in their right mind, indeed. And then lastly, I guess I wanted to say, I mean, I don't feel optimistic at all, frankly. But I feel like people make do and they keep going. And I think that to be someone who is a scholar of African American, Black diaspora history, race history in this moment, you cannot be optimistic given the literal murder of people every day, right? But I think what can give one, you know, some glimmer of hope is that there are, you know, self-care is inadequate, but there are sort of spaces and moments, not fully autonomous, of community, of gathering, of conversation. Oddly, thinking back to a few of us mentioned celebrity, you know, one of the, oh God, I'm forgetting her name, a sociological colleague whose name I'm forgetting did some interesting early work on what would become Black Twitter, and a lot of that work was sort of like, oh, Black people organize on Twitter around celebrity and these sorts of things, right? But what that allows is a kind of density that can be mobilized for other kinds of work, and those are the kinds of elements of... No, it's not Kathy, it's, oh Jesus, I'll remember. Yeah, voila.
I have a question for Merritt actually as well. I think when you're talking about in particular how the experience of trans people, so much of it involves constant encounters with pretty traumatic facts and materials, which also speaks to your point. I mean, especially now, you know, violence against these bodies is not contemporarily new in any way, but the ways in which we're constantly confronted with them. And I'm thinking now about, you know, the recent video, well, there's been so many when Black men get shot and that news and the images surrounding it are circulated and people are confronted in ways, I mean, that is felt very differently for people for whom that is evidence of their own personal immediate reality. When, the last month, so many Muslims were shot and killed, which again is something that probably didn't even make it to mainstream news sources many of us rely on. That was especially, traumatic to deal with that news, and so oftentimes the impulse then and part of the self-care we practice then is knowing when to tune out, when to tune in, and managing, what we feel our responsibilities to our communities are with respect to what we need in that moment to not break down entirely. And when so much of the world for marginalized people is designed to alienate you from your experience and create these fissures that do threaten your mental stability, Fanon is very right to observe that. I wondered, when you were talking about how video games have been, a lot of them produced as a way of coping with these realities. If you could speak more on, the experience of that constant trauma and how that relates to people negotiating their role in their community as well as trying to make attempts at taking care of themselves. It's a long question, sorry.
If I could not talk about games for a second. On principle, I try to talk about video games as little as possible, but I figured I'd make an exception for this panel. One thing that I think you were kind of circling around, or that I think is worth talking about directly, is the ways that that all of those things get drawn into performances online. That sharing and retweeting things get, and that's really basic stuff, right? But performances of allyship, especially, I think, of look at these horrible things that are happening. I'm aware.
Yeah.
I am making other people like me aware. And it's there were a lot of conversations, I've seen more and more conversations on my Twitter feed with regards to when there is a documented act of extreme violence, conversations around why are we sharing this these images? Who are they for? Do I need to see images of a black trans woman being killed? Is that something that who is that serving, I guess, and who is that who is being served by sharing these images?
Further traumatized.
Right. Yeah, there is a re-traumatization, I think, and obviously it's complicated because those same arguments have been used to essentially take away trans people's voices in. There's a lot of discussions around suicide contagion and should we share suicide notes and things like that. But I think the other impulse to sort of say no, we're not going to share any suicide notes is then that's almost equally as bad, right? So yeah, it's complicated, and I think having these conversations about who pieces of media are being created for or who we're sharing things for is it's really important.
Should we throw it open now to the audience? Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Does anyone have a question? I'm sorry.
Hello. Oh, wow, they're working. Okay. Hi. So thanks a lot for your effort and your time here and giving these talks. They were fascinating. This is a question I've been struggling with for a while, and I'm trying to frame it in a way that's applicable because I like everyone's responses. So I think the best way to do it is in science. And long story short, science seems to be a very, and by science I mean a way of thinking of rationally deducing things through the world. Because it seems to be a tool of liberation on some levels, but then on other levels it seems it's so reappropriated and used in very violent ways, right? Historically speaking, any colonial theater has used science as a way to keep powers that be as powers that be. And I think in the 21st century there's been, in a lot of social media areas, Less Wrong, for example, Elijah Yudkowsky, this kind of sense that cognitive bias is going to get rid of patriarchy and racism and all that jazz. So I guess the question would basically be how do you see science as a tool for maybe new politics of liberation? And is it salvageable? And that's a big question, but just any sense of what that might look like.
Should we have?
I'll jump in. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, so, okay. Wow, it's complicated, right? And I think probably like every like community that we're talking about negotiates that, and I think Alondra like described that dynamic really well of negotiating that sort of dance of like trying to refute science's negative claims about your group while simultaneously like leveraging it for positive community values. But I was like really blown away, but I had no idea about the pathogenic testing work. And I think the ways that science is like promising to me is always like decentralizing. So there, for example, like medical science is, as it turns out, a big deal for trans people. And medical gatekeeping, right? Like if you want any kind of like medical trans intervention, you have to deal with like the ethics of science and medical science. Not always, though. Like there have been moments in time when that's been disrupted. So during, for a period in I think like the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, there was a farm in rural Oregon where this like group of women were performing surgery, like orchiectomies, in a barn. And people would go there, and it was like a community science thing, and it was like an early like, I guess that was like in a way kind of like a biohacking project or like a citizen science or like garage science project. Maybe a little more dangerous than some of the other things you can do, but yeah, projects like that are really exciting to me because they represent this like taking away of or taking back of those tools from centralized depositories.
So when you first asked, is there a way that this is something that can be salvaged or what our thoughts are, I mean, my first instinct was to be like, no, this is not a field that has given me much, that can inspire much faith or trust in itself. But really that's more about, well, whose science? And so often these industries, as their, spheres for straight white males, have made those spaces very hostile and uninviting, and so much of the valuation and reliance on quote-unquote hard data, on analyses and statistics, has been a way of undermining and discounting the experiential evidence and the stories of marginalized people, and keeping those facts right in the realm of, well, that's just your feeling, or that's just your impression of how things are, and where's the data to back it up? Where you claim you were raped, well, rape statistics say that a lot of women are lying, and so, the sterilizations of black women that happened in prison, that was science. The sterilizations that happened in hospitals against South Asian women in England, that was science. So, do I trust science? Well, it's a very loaded question, because again, whose science? And the response, all of the sort of DIY alternative modes of survival that we've all sort of in our ways, touched on just now, were responses to the hostility of that field and its inaccessibility. So our ability to, how science can be salvaged is by allowing the rest of us to take part in unequal terms, and that's going to be, it's a very long journey ahead of us. If one you can even reasonably aspire to, without requiring far more radical uprooting of the structures as they are now. And the first thing to do then would be to making these spaces more available. And I think accessible is a very patronizing word, but right now we haven't even fully recognized the extent to which they're violent, right? So to salvage them, we need to reclaim them. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done from a lot of people to be able to do that, and that's going to require the people currently occupying that space to back off, right? So I'm talking about like full decolonization of a field.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question, but a very important one. And And I'm going to just briefly, again, turn to psychiatric survivors who in the 90s actually had to regain a voice by taking on the discourse of science, by saying that theories of brain pathology and also the science behind a lot of psychiatric meds was not only bunk in the way that it was being, put forward, but that there were serious medical, scientifically tracked side effects, right, that were altering brain structure. And so they had to rely on science at some level. But, one of the ways that they prevented, I think very smartly, from allowing that discourse to fully dominate the conversation, because there's so many risks to just fully take a scientific platform. You just cannot go there. And so they also at the same time had different discourses about that were really predicated on civil rights, autonomy, freedom, that were totally independent of that. So if one's going to go there, one better also have very kind of compelling arguments and frameworks. And actually, and this now goes to the second half, which is I actually teach a lot of future scientists, right? And one of the things I try to do in the teaching is show them that it's not only science that has material effects in the world, because they really do think that science is truth and everything else is secondary. And there's a great essay I have them read by Nietzsche on truth and lies, which really diagnoses the problem. Once science is about truth, everything else is in a subcategory. That's a problem, right? And so then I use examples in history, and the two ones I use are Susan Sontag's book. Oh my God, I'm blanking on the name of the illness book. Which one?
Illness is metaphor.
Yeah, illness as metaphor, right? I mean, that book was revolutionary. Yeah. Cancer was experienced as something shameful. Doctors wouldn't even tell you the diagnosis when you had it. And something like words alone fundamentally changed the experience of people with cancer. I was like, that's not science. Yeah. That's words. And that's powerful. And then I give a more contemporary example of the young woman at Columbia University who, with her art project, where she brought the mattress out on campus, all of a sudden forces the president to send a collective email to everyone about the issue. So I just kind of remind them that they may think science is more powerful because it's truth, but in fact, that's not necessarily the case. That's just the ideology of science monopolizing truth to the detriment to society at large.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question.
So, in the interest of in sickness and in health, I wanted to ask questions of the academics who have institutional connections about the moments that you use the social web and it's been an affordance for the things that you're trying to forward, and the times when it's been a constraint.
Did you want to go first? There we go.
You're laughing. That's a question. So the name I was thinking of is Esther Hargitay, the work is strength. I mean, I don't, it's, I'm so old that I've been doing something that looks like social media for a very long time. So, colleagues of mine that say oh, Twitter this and that, but I'm message boards this or once you have a kind of persona that's been doing it for, 15 years or something, it doesn't seem like a risky, it's just, there's a way in which it feels quite natural. And so, I mostly find it a good thing. I mean, I don't find,
I'm actually looking at the moment when you thought, it may have been resolved, but where you met with resistance, especially as an academic, and the moment where the social web helped you outside of the institution.
Sorry.
Well, let's just, we're running short on time.
I don't think I have a good answer. So we're running short on time. I mean, I don't know. Part of this academic disposition is that you argue with people, and so I don't really find them constraints. I find them opportunities for better arguments or to hear other arguments or whatever. I mean, I don't find, there are forms of social media I prefer to others, but I don't find it in generally a constrained space. I find it can be a sexist space about, but I feel, you probably have a much better answer to it.
I mean, maybe just briefly, I do like like that you have a space where you're not necessarily totally defined by your institutional context, and you can kind of take on a different persona and character and reach different publics, and that's very liberating in a lot of ways and been very exciting. On the other hand, what I worry about quite a bit is that it does seem, and this may be a particular problem in media studies, but people feel like they don't exist as a scholar unless they have a presence online, and that, again, is a problem.
Yeah.
That is a problem in a lot of ways, and it's something we need to figure out, because I do actually think that it is a problem if they're not online in some contexts. I mean, I don't think it's a problem. I just think it may be a problem for their career, right, which is a real shame. And I think you should be able to kind of opt out, but it does feel like, you know, everyone is funneled in that direction, and we're just kind of uncritically accepting it.
Okay, please thank all four of our panelists.